Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're deconstructing the really intense financial headwinds that are completely reshaping the medical equipment and supplies industry. We're looking at a space that researches, develops, and produces literally everything, from your basic disposable surgical gloves all the way up to highly specialized multi-million-dollar imaging instruments. It's an absolutely critical sector, but right now it is navigating a profound transformation. So we're going to unpack the specific market pressures bearing down on these companies and look at how they can use structured data to not just survive, but actually thrive in this environment.
Now, this brings us to a really fascinating paradox. How can an industry with such guaranteed, locked-in demographic growth be facing such severe margin compression? Think about it for a second. We have an aging global population, right? We're seeing an increased prevalence of chronic diseases tied to changing lifestyles. The demand for medical equipment and supplies has literally never been higher, and yet the folks manufacturing these critical tools, they're seeing their profitability squeeze tighter and tighter every single quarter. So what we're seeing is this massive tension, a real tug of war between expanding market access and intense downward pricing pressure driven by cost containment initiatives. On one side, you have these undeniable growth drivers, bringing millions of new patients into the healthcare system, especially in emerging markets. But on the flip side, massive market forces are neutralizing that growth. Health insurance expansion, well, it's a double-edged sword. While it absolutely creates more customers, it also empowers giant consolidated payers, government programs, and regulators to aggressively mandate cost reductions across the board. So the volume is going up, for sure, but the profit per unit is under unprecedented attack. To navigate this minefield, we turn to the SASB Sustainability Accounting Standard, specifically the healthcare sector standard for medical equipment and supplies. Think of this not as a compliance checklist, but as a strategic dashboard for mitigating operational risk. Now, under the stewardship of the ISSB, this framework provides the exact metrics that top investors and executives use to measure how well a company is weathering these intense market pressures. We aren't just looking at generic sustainability here. We are looking at hard, quantifiable financial resilience. Here's our quick roadmap for this explainer. First, the medical supply margin squeeze. Then, we'll hit the drivers of downward pricing, the hidden costs of compromise, supply chain vulnerabilities, and we'll finish up with a sustainable strategic blueprint. All right, let's dive into Section 1 and get a clear picture of this margin squeeze. Moving right along to Section 2, these specific drivers actively forcing prices down. Now, this is absolutely crucial to understand. Government insurance extensions and hospital consolidation are collectively squeezing pricing power right out of the manufacturer's hands. When hospitals consolidate into these massive provider networks and insurance companies merge into giant payer entities, they gain immense bargaining power. They don't buy 10 surgical tools anymore. They buy 10,000 at a time, and they demand steep discounts. You combine that with governments extending public insurance programs, which inherently rely on strict cost caps, and a global regulatory push to simply make healthcare cheaper. What you get is an environment where raising your prices to protect your margins is virtually impossible. So, how do we track the real impact of this? Well, to monitor actual affordability, the SASB standard requires tracking the percentage change in net price versus list price. This reveals the true financial reality after all those rebates and discounts are applied. It is incredibly revealing. A company might show a stable wholesale acquisition cost, their list price, making it look like their pricing power is totally intact. But when you look at the net price, the actual cash they collect after paying out the massive rebates demanded by those consolidated providers, you see the real margin erosion. Tracking the gap between these two numbers over time, it's basically the ultimate lie detector for a company's pricing strategy. Okay, Section 3. Let's look at what happens when companies make dangerous compromises to fight this squeeze. When margins are squeezed this tightly, the temptation is to artificially boost volume or maybe quietly cut manufacturing costs. In a desperate bid to increase market share, a company might subtly encourage physicians to use a device for a procedure it was never officially approved for. But off-label marketing and false claims aren't just ethical lapses. They result in massive, highly quantifiable monetary losses from legal proceedings that just destroy shareholder value. SASB tracks this specifically. While cutting corners might give you a temporary revenue bump, the regulatory backlash is brutal. The losses from civil judgments and regulatory penalties for false marketing can easily wipe out years of hard-fought margin gains. It gets worse on the production side. Compromises in manufacturing quality directly translate to the number of units recalled, enforcement actions, and tragically, actual fatalities. If a company reacts to pricing pressure by, say, quietly switching to a cheaper, unvetted component supplier, the results are going to show up directly in SASB's product safety metrics. We are talking about tracking the exact number of recalls issued, the total units affected, and most critically, fatalities linked to product failure. A single major recall or FDA warning letter, that can permanently damage a brand standing with those giant hospital networks we talked about earlier.
Now, as a smart mitigation strategy, companies can track the metric tons of products accepted for takeback. Breaking this down by complex devices versus basic supplies reduces future liabilities and meets growing sustainability demands. Think about it. Regulatory pressures aren't just about upfront costs anymore. They are increasingly about end-of-life disposal. Hospitals want to buy from suppliers who help them manage their own waste costs. By successfully running product take-back programs, whether that's refurbishing an MRI machine or recycling basic supplies, a manufacturer instantly differentiates themselves in a very crowded, price-sensitive market.
Moving to Section 4. Let's dive into the supply chain, which is arguably where these margin pressures create the biggest, most dangerous blind spots. When every single penny is pinched, supply chain visibility often becomes the very first casualty. Maintaining rigorous traceability through every single one of these distribution steps, using barcodes, RFID, you name it, is essential for protecting consumer health and corporate value. Say a defect is found in a surgical implant. A company must be able to instantly trace it from the hospital, through logistics, back to the exact production batch, and right down to the raw material sourcing. If they can't do that, a small, contained recall spirals into a massive, catastrophic one. And speaking of raw materials, if you aren't tracking your reliance on critical materials like rare earth elements and cobalt, your entire production line is uniquely vulnerable to sudden supply restrictions. The medical equipment industry relies heavily on this stuff for advanced imaging machines and electronic implants. But these inputs face immense physical limits, crazy price volatility, and high geopolitical risk. The standards demand that companies disclose exactly how they manage these risks, because honestly, an unexpected spike in palladium prices can obliterate whatever small margin a company has left if they haven't planned ahead. This brings us to audits. Monitoring the percentage of Tier 1 suppliers participating in third-party audit programs is a mandatory defensive strategy. It's just not enough for a company to say, hey, our own factories are safe. They have to prove their suppliers are, too. Disclosing the percentage of Tier 1 suppliers audited to recognize standards like ISO 13485 provides real transparency. In an era where companies might be tempted to use the cheapest possible overseas supplier just to maintain their margins, this metric ensures those cheap inputs aren't introducing catastrophic quality risks into the final medical device. All right, our final section. Let's see how treating these standards as a CEO dashboard provides a true blueprint for survival. By treating these disclosure topics not as compliance chores but as critical KPIs, executives can actively manage operational risks. That list versus net price metric, it tells you if your pricing strategy is actually surviving hospital consolidation. Your recall and enforcement data, it tells you if cost-cutting has dangerously compromised your manufacturing floor. Your audit metrics tell you if your supply chain is basically a ticking time bomb. This data isn't just for a nice-to-have sustainability report. It is the fundamental operational telemetry you need to pilot a medical supply company through today's economic turbulence. Ultimately, embracing transparent pricing and solid ethical governance actually becomes a competitive advantage in a restricted market. As the standard points out, companies that effectively manage these cost containment pressures don't just survive, they actually capture market share. When governments expand healthcare access, millions of new patients enter the system. If you are the manufacturer who can provide safe, traceable, and reliably marketed products at a fair, transparent price point that those huge consolidated buyers accept, you are going to win those massive high-volume contracts. You literally turn a margin killer into a volume driver. So I'll leave you with this final thought. In an industry being squeezed so tightly by relentless cost containment, payer consolidation, and regulatory limits, is your strategic dashboard robust enough to turn these risks into your next great opportunity? The demographic demand for healthcare is guaranteed, but your place in supplying it? That is not. Thanks so much for joining me in this explainer. See you next time.